Hello everyone. Today I'm going to dealing with the topic the silence of Friday and the silencing of refugees, a post-colonial reading of four in the age of migration. Here is my academic information, table of content and research question is that how does the silencing of Friday and coexist for reflect the systematic marginalization, refugee voice in contemporary media and global migration context, and what does this reveal about continuity of subaltern suppressed from colonial to modern times? Hypothesis is that Friday's enforced silence in four symbolize the broader pattern of subaltern marginalization which persists in the age of migration as the refugees voice are often mediated, misrepresented, or ignored in media and policy discourses, demonstrating that historical structures of power and silencing continue to shape whose stories are heard and whose are suppressed. Introduction. Friday is a character in Foe by James Coetzee, forcibly replaced and rendered speechless, voiceless in other narratives. Refugees today often endure similar silencing. Their stories are told by media, governments, NGOs, not always by themselves. Friday's silence in Foe serves as a metaphor for structural suppression of refugees' voice in news, media, and public discourses, which post-colonial theory helps us to understand and critique. Foe in Friday's silence. So Susan Barton tries to repeatedly to articulate Friday's story and give him speech, but Friday's voice remains mediated, interpreted, and constrained by Susan Crusoe and Foe. Robert Cusack argues in arguing for that unheard search of Friday in James Coetzee's Foe that the whole enterprise of giving voice to natives and unachievable and totally objectionable, favoring the subaltern silencing being perceived in terms of triumph and victory over the dialectical power. These writers are L. Idrisi, L. Faith, and E.I. Hebok. In countering his story, the policies of silence view Friday's silence not passively but an active form of resistance. Theoretical foundations, voice, power, and the subaltern. Gayatri Spivak can speak. Subalterns are a people marginalized in power structures, even their representation in mediated by elites. Edward states Orientalism, the construction of the other by dominant discourses, representation is a political. Finance, the rage of the earth, colonial violence, displacement, identity loss. Fanon argues that colonial Nizam not only exploit people physically but also damage their psychology and sense of identity. Colonial displacement and symbolic silencing. Friday's missing tongue in Foe symbolize the erasure of voice and identity under colonial domination. In the same way, modern refugees experience displacement and silencing in global narratives. The age of migration, in contemporary context. Global displacement trends. As of 2024, there are 170.3 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, including 42.7 million refugees. This marks as a significant increase from previous years to highlighting the growing scale of global displacement. Raising asylums applications, the number of asylum seekers has risen from 4.1 million in 2020 to 5.4 million in 2022, reflecting a more than 30% increase in just 2 years. A case study, Syrian refugees and US media frames partisan coverage. A research by these scholars analyzed that 47,388 US news articles from 2011 to 2019 about Syrian refugees. This study investigates that how political biases influence refugees' representation in American media. Left-leaning media frames that outlets like a New York Times and Washington Post often describe refugees as a child victim as a symbol of suffering, emphasizing on humanitarian empathy, portraying America as a welcoming and responsible nation. Right-leaning media frames that outlets such as Fox News or Breitbart depict refugees as a security threat or Islamic terrorist. Focus shift from humanitarian needs to national security, creating fear-based narrative. So these same groups is presented through two conflict lenses, sympathy versus fear. Case study second, Syrian refugees in Turkey, human interest versus victimization. Dalia Abdelhadi and Fatmur Delioglu, human interest stories in the coverage of Syrian refugees, a case study from Turkey, Mashriq and Mazhar. The study examined that Zaman newspaper and found contradictory portrayals. Refugees were both victimized and humanized in Turkish media. Even when stories focused on compassion, the persistent uses of the refugee label erase individual and enforced collective stereotypes. Comparative framing: Ukraine, Afghan, and Syrian refugee crisis. It could have been a media frames the coverage of Ukrainian, Afghan, and Syrian refugee crisis. This study compares how media and Europe in the UK portrays different refugee groups. News reports of Ukraine refugee situation have been marked by affectionate headlines and the outpouring of support and sympathy, arguing not seen previously in the context of the refugee crisis outside of Europe. A case study: Rohingya and international media and its effect. So, Rohingya Muslim minority Myanmar faced systemic violence and persecution from 2010 to 2020, forcing hundreds of thousands to flee to Bangladesh and other countries. Even though the New York Times and Guardian highlighted the crisis and created international pressure, the violence and the displacement continued. This shows that media attention alone cannot fully amplify refugee voices. Their suffering is seen but not always addressed. Counter narratives and refugee agency. A comparative study of mainstream media and Twitter. Twitter provide more multifaceted narrative after event like Ellen Coetzee's death. Mainstream media were more framed. Unlike the mainstream media, Twitter offered an alternative and multifaceted narrative not bound by geopolitics, raising awareness and calling for solidarity and empathy towards those affected. Here is a comparison between Friday and in this age of refugee voice in case studies. So Friday, who has no command of words and story, and his story also told by others, is like sometimes victimized or sensationalized, sometimes humanized, and sometimes ignored these colonized people. Critical viewpoints and limitations. So, Emily Burns in the Syrian refugee narrative states that refugees were depicted positively overall, but framing was dominated by government responses and conflict narratives, showing that even positive coverage carries limitations. From symbolic annihilation, study of media's near total absence of refugee voices during COVID points to passive silencing rather than active representation. This critics reveals that being heard in mean is not enough. How, by whom, and under what terms matter. Analytical insights: Friday silence and refugee silencing are not identical. Friday is a fictional and totally voiceless. Refugees have partial voice in many contexts, but structural similarity exists: lack of control over narrative, being framed by others, having voice overshadowing or ignored. Refugees agency is emerging in counter narrative spaces. This acts as a species of refugee. Conclusion: Coexist give us a powerful metaphor of to understand modern refugee silencing. The case study shows that media both silences and partially amplifies refugees' voice, depending on framing, region, and politics. Policy media suggestion more refugees lead storytelling, more platform giving refugees control over their narratives, more awareness of framing. Here are my references, and thank you. Now, if you have any questions, then feel free to ask.
So, Krupali, my question is, what role can literature play in the giving voice to the voiceless?
Yes, so literature giving voice to voiceless, because people who are marginalized, colonized people, and poor people are also ignored by journalists and historians whose story is not that much popularized and told. So literature giving voice to those who are voiceless, and we have writers such as Coetzee, Fanon, and Henry, who are also write on the colonized people, so they give voice to them. Okay, thank you. This is from my side.